Welcoming the next recipient of the Foreign Policy Association's medal to the podium, Mr. Chuck Hagel.
Thank you very much. Well, giving a former senator the podium at 9:30 at night is not a good idea, Cash, but nevertheless, you made a fundamental error, and I'll take advantage of your good humor. First, let me thank the Foreign Policy Association for this recognition, which I am deeply grateful for, and tell you that I have been for many years, long before I was in the United States Senate, a great admirer of this institution and what it does, what it's done, and I think the role it will continue to play in a very complicated world. So thank you for what you do, all of you, and the time and the effort and the resources that you apply every day to doing something to enhance not just our country, but mankind. And that should be the objective of all institutions. To these brilliant young men and women from West Point and to their leaders who are represented, thank you for your service to our country. We're very proud of you. I don't know of a higher honor I had than serving as the Secretary of Defense. The privilege I had to be part of your team for a couple of years. I occasionally am asked, well, what should we call you now? And I think I was asked that tonight. Senator, Secretary, Sergeant, other not as flattering comments that have been referenced before my name. But I said probably the only job that I ever had that was a real job was when I was a sergeant. And I would tell you that my time in uniform was one of those transformational, defining times in my life. And I don't know of anyone who has worn the uniform of the United States military who would not say that about their experience. So to these great men and women and your families, I know the tremendous sacrifice and burden that your families do. Thank you. I want to also acknowledge the ambassadors here tonight, the representatives from other countries, who I know some of you and have had long relationships with some of you. And I want to just say that your presence, your involvement, what you do for your countries and for the United Nations, for our world, remains critically important, and will be as important as it's ever been as we get deeper into this new, combustible, complicated, interconnected world. So thank you for your service. And again, to all of you, thank you for taking a little of your time on a Wednesday night to come out and have dinner with me and allow me to be part of your institution. What I'd like to do is, to your great relief, I know, not give a speech, make some overview comments, and then we'll just open it up, Pat, to the audience. You might get a lot more out of it than hearing some broken down old politician and former espouse thoughts about the world. But in the interest of stimulating any conversation here tonight, and I suspect that's not necessary, let me make a couple of comments. I was watching the other night PBS, the documentary on the Roosevelt family, which I suspect most of you have seen. And and I was on the PBS board, so I acknowledge that I'm a great admirer of what PBS does. But one of the references made toward the end of the special, which was focused on the end of Roosevelt's life, the reference that he made, I believe, right after he gave his last inaugural address, which was his fourth, as you all know, the shortest presidential inaugural address since George Washington, lasted less than 5 minutes, said as much in that 5 minutes as anyone that I'm aware of has ever said, and I often quote many of the things Roosevelt said in that fourth inaugural. But there was a reference to that in that he was to give one more speech. And that one more speech, his last speech before he died, was to this institution, which I suspect most of you know that. I've not read that speech, but I have heard it referenced many times as to how important that speech was, because he talked about the United Nations, the importance of this new world body, and in ways he referenced the dynamics of a shifting, defining world order that was about to be built at the end of World War II. Very analogous to the kind of world that we live in today. And that might puzzle most of you. Many things I have said in life puzzle many people. But it shouldn't, because the 70 years that world order, that Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower and the great leaders from around the world, many countries represented here, that world order they built and defined was centered around something that the world had never seen before, and that was the establishment and the use of coalitions of common interests. And those coalitions of common interest started with the United Nations. Bretton Woods brought the IMF, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which, as we all know, is the WTO today. NATO came in 1949, the greatest collective security institution in the history of man, and still is as relevant, I think, in many ways as it was then as it has been. Different times, different threats, different challenges, different dynamics, but so too has it always been, that through the course of history. But that experiment in world governance, in a general term, worked pretty well. Imperfect. Institutions can't solve every problem. But it did something pretty remarkable when you look at the last 70 years. No World War III, no nuclear exchange. Can we, on balance, say that more people today in the world have more possibilities, more opportunities than ever before, and more prospects? I think so. The countries, the regions in the world today that are in great conflict and chaos are the ones that were left behind after World War II, that did not benefit from the coalitions of common interest and did not benefit from a new world. So we are today in the process of building and defining a new world order. Different, absolutely. More complicated, absolutely. More difficult, absolutely. If for no other reason than really the United States of America after World War II was the only power that was left standing that had an economy. So it was much easier to bring countries and nations together. The other thing that's different today, and this is again why your institution is so important, is the fact, and I think a measurement of the success of the last 70 years in a great way, that the very things that we tried to do and what we wanted to accomplish as a free world, and that we sought to accomplish, in fact, has happened in many parts of the world. Global economy, market economies, higher standards of living, more education, better prospects, more hope. Not everywhere. And what has come with that is an expectation level that we've never seen in the world. We are now in the third, fourth generations of leadership of countries all over the world. And just as we know from any cursory reading of history, each generation builds itself into a different set of expectations based on the realities of the time. But the magic of America, the magic of the countries in the world that have sustained human rights and freedom of choice in their economies, has been respect for the individual, to allow that individual to grow, to prosper, to get an education. It's imperfect. We still haven't figured it all out in this country. It's why we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. We didn't get it all right the first time, and we're still working on it. But we have a process that gives us the ability to self-correct. And that was probably as essential as anything that went into what Franklin Roosevelt and those great leaders at the time wanted to build. Second, I noted at the table tonight that now that I have less responsibilities in my life, I'm able to read a little more based on what I want to read. And I have started to go back through Dean Acheson's book, Present at the Creation. I suspect most of you have read that book or parts of that book, but it is worthy of a read. It's a long book. The print is very small, so it's challenging. But what Dean Acheson said about that 4-year period that I was just referring to, those defining years as when a new world order was built, and built throughout the 50s and in the 60s, really is a framework of what we're all going through today. When you look down the list of the table of contents of his chapters, and he breaks them down by subtitles and subchapters of chapters, so it's very easy to go right to areas that you have an interest in. It's the same countries that Iran is very prominent, and what happened in the 50s, Mossadegh, the British, the United States, oil. I mean, we haven't come too far. China is a big part of this. Certainly, Soviet Union was a big part of it. Western Europe, NATO, trade. Now, it has gone in different directions. But when you go down through those subtitles of his book, it's the same players that keep popping up. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that not only those leading countries are still leading countries, some leading more than others, but it also tells us that it is critically important, even more than when Dean Acheson was Secretary of State, that we turn our transmitters off more often and turn our receivers on more often. That we try to get to know much better than we do different cultures, different religions, different histories, different dynamics. The history of the Middle East, and I'm not an expert on the Middle East or anything, is a complicated history. We all know enough about the Middle East. Many of you know a lot about the Middle East. Historic dynamics, religious dynamics, tribal, ethnic, the colonial period. So, in a world where technology has now overtaken almost everything, that has given the non-state actors, which have become in many ways more dangerous than state actors, because technology has changed all of that. It has also projected on us this great universe of new technologies, great opportunities to do tremendous things for people. Medicine, to start with, but also new challenges. And I often think of the great historian Arnold Toynbee, who wrote this magnificent book. I never read it all. I looked at maps and pictures and would read different parts of it. But this magnificent book on the history of civilizations. And he charted out in that book 24 civilizations. And why did so many of those civilizations not last? And he said he came to realize that it was one dynamic that made the difference in the end everywhere, no matter where you were, what your religion was, what kind of government. And that was a very simple dynamic of challenge, response, challenge, response. We're all challenged in our lives, our personal lives, our professional lives. Countries are challenged, regions are challenged. But it's always how we respond. Challenges are not new. The dimensions of a challenge are different, of course. But how do you respond? That gets us into wise leadership, and that gets us into smart use of technology. And I will end this way and then open to questions. And I see in the different jobs I've had in my life and the opportunities I've had to be all over this world long before I was a senator or secretary of defense, but more today than any other Arnold Toynbee dimension of challenge response. It's critically important that the United States and our allies, but particularly the United States, not allow the big problems or the small problems to become big problems. Not allow the small issues to become very complicated big issues and therefore get out of hand. And in a combustible, hair-triggered world, it is very difficult. We must not allow ourselves to get caught in the downdrafts of crisis. We cannot engage every provocative action in the world, no matter where it is. And something else that Toynbee was very clear about in his book of Civilizations is that even great powers have great limitations. That goes for corporations, that goes for institutions, that goes for individuals. If you don't recognize your limitations, then you're probably headed for trouble at some point. And that has really been the history of great empires and civilizations that have not lasted. And that's I believe will be a key challenge for us, the United States and our allies, is to be aware of that and keep the small things in the small channels, manage wisely through all of this. I don't know where we are in this process of a new world order or defining of a new world order. I don't know if we're in the middle of it, the front end of it, the back end, but we're in it. And it's going to take us some time to work through it. And I don't know if there will be a time in modern history, I won't be around for it, where we will have another 70-year period of so much stability. And you say, my God, stability, what's he talking about? Well, the world's a pretty big place, 7 billion people. Demographers tell us 9 billion by 2050, probably get to 9 billion before that. When you think of the challenges and what's going on in the world, just starting with the human needs, water, food, air, environment, medicine, hope, education, jobs, opportunities. And we've done a pretty good job with all that. Not anywhere near where we need to be. So I end with this last point, and it's where I began, from Franklin Roosevelt's fourth inaugural address in 1945, when he reminded in that short address, after America, the world was coming out of this terrible, terrible, terrible war that has devastated the world, that it's always important to look at the long trend of history. And he said in that speech that the long trend of history is always upward. It has always been upward. And we must not allow ourselves to lose or misunderstand or forget that dimension when we're in these periods of great challenge and great turmoil and great chaos, where we think there's no end or we will go the other way. That's not the way the world has been. Doesn't mean it will always be that way. But I thought that was an encouraging way to end that speech that he gave in 1945. And he knew he was dying. And he knew what America had just come through. But more importantly, he knew what the British and all the Europeans and people all over the world had gone through. And that's what I would like to leave tonight in my comments, because I think it is easy to step back and not frame that up in the larger context of history and what we're going through now. And it's easy to dismiss the longer pull of history, and we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that. Again, thank you for giving me an opportunity to tell you a couple of things, at least, about what I think and where we are in the world. I look forward to your questions, and I'm particularly grateful and honored by this recognition from an institution that I think very highly of and value what you do very much. So thank you. Pat, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks.
Thank you.
Okay, now you actually brought this up. You said people are asking, do they call you secretary, do they call you senator, do they call you sergeant? I don't think you really answered that.
Chuck.
Okay. We'll go with an informal program tonight. As the moderator, I get the privilege of asking the first question. Something you said in your remarks was that we live in a combustible, complicated, interconnected world. We can all agree to that. Do we have domestically the right government structure to deal with that? I mean, essentially, we have a government that is set up with a post-World War II structure, and the lines between the military and intelligence exist as they always have. We're not sure who's responsible for cybersecurity threats. Should this be rethought, or can we work within the existing framework?
Well, this country has been a functioning republic for 250 years, and we have stumbled along pretty well. Every year of those 250 years, there's been a new challenge, a new problem, new responsibility, and all you need to do is just read a little history. It doesn't take long to read our history compared to the British and others represented here, because ours is not a long history. But, you know, I go back to the 1840s and the 1850s. There was a political party in this country that was known as the Know-Nothings. And the Know-Nothings were a rather significant political force in this country. And if you read at the time what the commentators wrote about it, this would be the end of American democracy, the end of government, we can't do anything, we're dysfunctional. Sounds a little familiar to what's going on in Washington, especially with the latest Gallup poll coming out last week saying the job approval rating of Congress is 8%. And John McCain always would reference that by saying, and that's just the family of the politicians, the 8%. Our government is dysfunctional. It is paralyzed. It is polarized in many ways. I don't think that's a problem with the structure, with the institutions. It's the individuals. Institutions and structures are products of what individuals build and make and expect. It is the individual that makes a corporation work or not. So I don't think there's anything wrong with our structure, and we adapt as we go along. Let's take the Senate, which I know a little something about, served 12 years there. The Senate, as you all know historically, was a compromise with the small states, and it was set up as a minority interest institution. It was set up to protect the little states. So the Senate has always had different rules than the House, and they are arcane, I get that, but the other part of it is, too, I always remember it was James Madison who wrote that it was designed by our brilliant, brilliant, brilliant founding fathers to assure that government was difficult, because the 12 years I spent in the Senate, as an example, made me reflect on this all the time. If a lot of things would have happened, laws passed in those 12 years, it would not have enhanced America. There's a reason why there's a certain dysfunction in the Congress of the United States. That's to slow down a lot of stuff, bad stuff, that you don't get a lot of stuff that's through that shouldn't get through. And it was noted that the House is the cup, the vessel that represents the hot, passionate, steaming House of Representatives. The saucer is the cooling dimension of the Senate. Now, being a senator, I use that term often. My House colleagues never quite accepted that, but actually it was a quote from a House member, that the Senate was to cool it down. And so I don't think it's a matter of the function of our government or our structure. We adapt all the time. Department of Homeland Security, for example, and I'll end this way, we created after 9/11. Now, looking back on that, could we have done that differently? Should we have done that differently? We rolled 22 different departments and agencies up into this one monolithic department that really no one has been able to govern or manage because it's just too big. We'll eventually get there. But the point of that was, and why, you mentioned intelligence and military, it's the same thing that we did in 1986 in the Goldwater-Nichols law, which integrated the services, which integrated all of our services. Probably as important a law in military since World War II, to integrate the capabilities of all of our services. Same thing we did in Homeland Security was to integrate the use of all of our intelligence agencies. Our intelligence agencies didn't talk to each other. We have 16 intelligence agencies in the United States. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't communicate. That's partly why we had 9/11. And so I think we made it better. It was imperfect, a lot of raggedy parts to it, but I said earlier about self-correction. We can self-correct, we can build, but it's the individual, it's the people in the institutions, either they make it work or they don't, and we're going to have to continue to put the responsibility on them.
All right, let's open it up to the room. If you've got a big voice, we'll just have you shout out your question. We've got a microphone back in the room too. Let's start right here with the yellow tie there. Go ahead, please, sir.
Yellow tie.
The handsome man with the yellow tie, I might add.
Sergeant Hagel,
Yes, sir.
obviously you're not offended by that.
No, I'm proud of that title.
Around our, when friends get together these days and look over the candidates for potential presidential candidates, a particular question comes up periodically. I'm sure that some of you will recognize it, which is that maybe it's time for a vet to come forth and be a candidate. I'm not sure we've seen a vet. I'm not sure there's been a vet since President Bush, H.W. Bush. Isn't that correct?
Well,
I think.
George W. Bush was in the National Guard, and we had candidates, McCain, Kerry, candidates, but not
Candidates.
presidents. But
Not-
Clinton was not in,
But not a president. So my first question
and
is-
Obama was not in.
My first question is, what is your view of that sentiment, which has some popular support? And another question is, a related question is, what's your view of a draft, military draft? Is that something only to be considered under conditions of world war? Or is there something to be said for it in other
Yeah.
lesser circumstances?
Well, on your first question, I think the qualifications of a presidential candidate or anyone seeking high office are always critically important, and I think the voters should judge the qualification of the candidate based on the experiences of that candidate. I think a veteran who has had some time in uniform enhances his or her credentials and judgment. That said, I don't think it's necessary that a president or a senator or a governor or any person holding high office has had to be in the military. I think it enhances them, as I do a wide swath of experiences for any candidate, because it comes down to, I think, the three most important things that you look for in any candidate or any leader of any institution, and it doesn't change. Character, courage, and judgment. Those are the three. Everything else falls underneath those three. And that applies for any job, any big job. As to the draft, our world is now so much more complicated than it was when I was in Vietnam and when we did away with the draft in the early 70s, went to an all-volunteer force. The sophistication of weaponry, for example, and communications is so beyond anything that a draft army has ever had to deal with. And because the capabilities and the strength of a military today, it's still about the individual. Because you can have all the sophisticated weaponry in the world, but if you don't have the right guys commanding and people in charge and men and women who know what they're doing and who are well trained, well led, then it won't work. And so my point is, I don't think the draft would be an answer. I think it'd be more complicated. I mean, if America is attacked, but I don't believe if that occurs, it will come as a result of all the Chinese navies on one side and the Russian navies flowing in and all their bombers overhead. Cyber is the most deadly weapon against America today and will continue to be. You don't judge winning wars today just on a military-to-military basis. If you hollow out our economy, if you weaken our economy, which is really the one fundamental strength a nation has, aside from a nation of laws and a constitution, but your economy is the most critical component of any dimension of government. Because without an economy, you can't afford anything else. So the world today is such that I don't think a draft would be the right thing. I don't really envision a situation where you would even have another draft. By the time you would train people to just do basic things, it would be too complicated, too burdensome. There is no time now, no margin left in anything. The sophistication of missiles, nuclear weapons, still very real, of cyber, this doesn't take weeks. This is minutes and hours. So you wouldn't even have kids on a train and a bus, and you'd pretty much have most of the conflict over with. So it would really be, I think, irrelevant today, any kind of a draft.
Leave that there for you.
Thank you.
Talking for a while. I saw a question back here from, go for it. I'd love to get a military representative here.
All right, great. Sir, it's an honor to be here. I'm a cadet from West Point. I'm curious if you advocate for the two-state solution between the Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, and if so, what does Israel need to do to further that peace process, and what roles should the United States play in that?
Thank you, and thank you for what you're doing. Very proud of you. I'm a strong advocate of a two-state solution, have been. The reality is that people of the world have to live together. And we've got to find the common denominators that allow that to happen. The United States cannot impose its will. We get into a lot of trouble in the world when we try to do that, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq or wherever. These issues have to be sorted out by the people there. We can help, we can support, we can help build alliances and coalitions, but the Israelis and the Palestinians have to sort this out. Now, we can enhance that by helping lead that, and it's a delicate balance. It's a delicate balance, and it takes time, but there is no other alternative because of some of the things I talked about here tonight. You all know the world is now completely interconnected, and it's not going to disconnect, or it's not going to unwind. A good example of that is the Russian situation. I mean, we have ratcheted sanctions up on Russia, continue to do that with our European allies, but we calibrate what sanctions we can put on them, because we quickly get into a situation where we're hurting our own people, especially in financial services, if you're not careful. Complicated, but we have to keep working at it. The United States is the only country in the world that has the ability to be able to lead and bring together these coalitions that can help solve the problems. We can't solve the problem. We're not going to solve the problem in the Middle East. We can help build the right forums to do that. We can support allies, but these are too big, too complicated, these problems. And we've learned some pretty hard lessons over the recent years with this. America just recently came through 13 years of unprecedented war, 2 wars. We've never been at war that long, ever. But probably even more interesting and damaging to all of the men and women in uniform in your families here is that we did this with an all-volunteer force. It's never been done before. And what that's meant is we have put tremendous stress and strain on our military and their families. 5, 6, 7 tours, combat tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. Because the pool that you have to draw from, it's the same people. You just keep sending them back, keep sending them back. And you can't do that to human beings. You cannot do that to human beings.
We're going to put our head table on the spot here. Who at the head table has a question?
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, first of all, congratulations. It's a great honor for
Thank
us
you.
to be here. And of course, you looked at us, to the ambassadors here sitting, representing the countries in the United Nations. So I would say we really live in this chaotic world, in this chaotic order, and we are all looking for the future, what it will be. What is your idea? How could we have a more responsive and more creative UN? How could we create a more responsive and creative UN which would be able really to give the answers to the world today? Because we have been, after 70 years, still talking about the reforms and the different problems within the UN, but I would be very interested, what is your vision about that? Thank you very much.
Well, Madam Ambassador, thank you, and you represent Hungary. And I think I mentioned that I've been to Budapest many times, in your country many times. In fact, a company that I started built the first fiber optics telephone system around the airport at Monar, outside of Budapest. So I used to get over there often in 1991, 92, and I think 93 is when we finished it. First, I think we recognize that institutions cannot solve every problem. And I'm a strong advocate of the United Nations and always have been, and I think it's as relevant today as it has ever been, and maybe more so in the future, for the reasons we all know. Not unlike the answer I gave on our American political system and our government and our structure, leaders matter. Leaders always matter. The strength of leadership at the United Nations, the strength of leadership in each of the individual countries you represent to believe in the United Nations, want the United Nations to play more of a role, is critically important. Because if your leaders don't feel that way, you are limited as a representative of your country, like any ambassador, on how much you can do. If we don't bring many of these issues to the United Nations in some way, and recognizing, 191 countries, something like that there are so many vast differences in issues and so on that you're not going to solve it all there. But you can get these big and important and complex issues to higher platforms of resolution. Most big problems in the world do not have simple solutions or quick solutions. Most big problems in the world are solved through a series of resolutions to get to a solution. But you build platforms to get there. And I think that's one of the great contributions the United Nations has made and can continue to make. I wish I had a glib, quick, fast, breaking news answer for you, but I don't think it's that simple. And it's a lot of hard work, like every ambassador in this room knows, and it's a lot of drudgery. You just keep at it. But leaders matter. Leaders have to put a premium on that institution to help things. And again, recognizing you can't fix it all, you can't solve it all. No country will ever give up its interests to another institution. The United States surely wouldn't, Hungary wouldn't, Britain wouldn't, no country, South Korea, no country represented here. Every nation always responds in its own self-interest. Corporations do, individuals do. That's actually a reliable dynamic and anchor to know when you're in a deal with somebody. And also, where you run into trouble if you don't know that, is you don't know what they're going to do. North Korea is a good example. I mean, from hour to hour, what the hell they're thinking and who's in charge and the danger that they represent. Now, there's a consistency in that dynamic of self-interest. And that's something, too, that's a limiting factor in a way to the United Nations. But it's also something that you recognize in dealing with what you're dealing with. So I wish I had a better answer. I wish I was smarter. But I just think it's, as you know and the ambassadors do, a lot of hard work.
I've got time for 2 more questions. Let me get over to this side of the room. Yes, sir.
Sir, I had the pleasure of speaking to an 06 at CENTCOM on my way in today. And the Army's understanding is that there's another 30,000 troop reduction scheduled. And the fear among the leadership appears to be that we're headed to go below 400. We're down to a 263 ship fleet from 600 or what have you. And we're shifting now to Asia. We've got problems in the East and the West. It reminds me of the limbo dance. How low can we go and still be prepared to meet our obligations? I'm of the view that we're too low as it is, and I wondered what your view was.
Well, it's my view as well. I don't think we're headed for a 400, you're talking about the Army, a 400,000 person Army. And you mentioned the ships. 2 answers. Number one, I agree with your premise. And I fought very hard as Secretary of Defense. But we were talking at the table tonight about sequestration, what that has done to our budget. And sequestration, as I said, it's as irresponsible and mindless a way to defer governance and the responsibility of governments that I've ever seen. I've never seen anything so irresponsible. And both parties are to blame on this. I don't think it gets lifted in this political year. The budgets I presented to the Congress, as you broke those budgets down, the chiefs come before Congress, explain, Chief Staff of the Army. Ray Odierno has been very clear on this. I mean, we don't want to get below a certain number. Same as the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations for the Navy. But the reality is, if we don't have the money, you're going to have to cut somewhere. I had to do a lot of cutting. I was the first Secretary of Defense 3 days after I took office, sequestration hit. There was no budget for sequestration. The White House had told Defense not to prepare a budget for sequestration because it never happened. That first year that I had sequestration, we had to shut down all of our training for all our Air Force, Navy, and Marines and Army for 5 months because we didn't have the money. We had to defer maintenance on all our facilities for 6 months. There was a 16-day government shutdown. I had to furlough people. This was not a happy time. But when you're just like a leader of any institution, a corporation, anything else, I as Secretary of Defense had to work with the resources I had. And that's the reality. What's particularly dangerous is what this does to not having that's any kind of certainty, or rather put it, the cloud of uncertainty hanging over you. You can't plan. The Department of Defense is the biggest, most complicated enterprise in the world. Our chiefs and all those who are responsible for every facet of our national security enterprise have to have some certainty to plan new weapons acquisitions, new technologies, training. I mean, our chiefs all think through many in the military know this very well here tonight. Corporate heads know this. Your 3 and 5 year plans down the road, you have to have some certainty as to what your resources are going to be before you can entertain any new research dimension in staying ahead of the Chinese and fighter jets or whatever it is. Manpower in the Pentagon today, in every facet of manpower, pay, benefits, pension, health care, housing, represents more than 50% of the entire Defense Department budget. And it's climbing like this. So if we continue on the trajectory we're on, you got the next series of secretaries are going to have 2 choices. You continue to cut the numbers in order to fulfill the commitments that you have on retirement packages and on continuing to be able to recruit and retain good people through benefits, pay, housing, medical, and everything that goes with that. Or you start bringing down those benefits so that you can keep the numbers up, but then you run into a recruitment and retainment problem, because the people that you really want to make sure that stay, because these young captains start to think through, now wait a minute, where are we going? Their wives, their husbands say, is this the kind of life we want with this kind of uncertainty? And you start losing those mid-grade officers and enlisted that are really the heart of a military. The generals are not the heart of the military, and any generals in the room forgive me, but the generals will be the first to tell you that. The people who do the fighting and the dying and the execution of everything in the military are the middle to junior officers and enlisted. And you want them smart. You want them well-trained. You want them well-motivated. So this is a very complicated problem. This is an area that I warned about for 2 years. I'll end this way. The last interview I did with Barbara Starr at CNN came in about a week before I left, and she said, Mr. Secretary, after you've seen what you've been through the last 2 years, what do you leave this office with as to your biggest fear? What bothers you the most? And I said, hands down, the one thing that I am most concerned about is the internal challenges that we have. And by that, I meant the things we're talking about. Because if we don't straighten some of this out, we're going to pay a high price with our military down the road. And you're already seeing it, the stress and the strain. These young people are, a lot of them are going to be dealing with issues for a long time. And I'm not talking about just the severely wounded. I mean, that's a whole different category. But on medication, a lot of problems that we've kind of covered up. And I've tried to be very transparent about that. I wasn't always supported on that. But America's got to know it isn't just giving parades to our military and buying them drinks in the airport and saying, great job, we're proud of you. That's good, that's important, but you got to know the rest of the story too. And the American people got to know that.
One more question over here on this side of the room.
What do you think of the Iran nuclear soon-to-be agreement?
Well, what I know of it now, and of course I've been out of the Pentagon for about 3 months, but I was involved right up until I left in that deal. First of all, I have always been a supporter of engaging Iran for a lot of reasons. I don't think things get better when you don't. And I often have said, engagement is not appeasement. Engagement is not surrender. We're the greatest power on earth. My God, if we can't engage, then there's really no hope for the world. We know what Iran is, a state sponsor of terrorism. We know the threats. We know what they've been up to. But that doesn't fix the problem. One option is, okay, go to war in Iran. Well, if you want to do that, you better think about it, because this isn't a Saddam Hussein deal, if you want to start that deal. So you better think very carefully about your options here. Now, on the deal itself, you read here just recently and today and what the Supreme Leader has been saying, and he's been ratcheting up the rhetoric, and no unfettered inspections of military installations. We want those sanctions dropped immediately, so on and so on and so on. Well, these are all public posturing things, but we've put ourselves out there publicly, as well as the P5+1 nations that are with us. So it is going to be difficult to square what we in the P5+1 have been saying publicly, on that we'll phase out sanctions if we can get the deal we want, and we're going to demand inspections of their military sites, when the Iranians are saying just the opposite, there is no deal. So it'll be a little hard to balance that. This probably goes past the June 30th deadline. I think we're smarter to keep at it. I think it's smarter, better. I don't know how much, if anything, has changed since I was there on where we are, but I would, bottom line would say this. If we can get a deal that's generally acceptable, you're not going to get the deal that we all would like. It's not going to happen. But if you can get a deal that gives you enough confidence in the verification process, the verification process is the key. That gets you to the next stage, to the next plateau. There's not going to be any settlement in Syria, in Iraq, and all the rest without the Iranians. Without the Russians, too, by the way. It's not going to happen. It will not happen without the Iranians and the Russians. So some of those offline conversations are being held. This deal is about the nuclear deal. And by the way, it does not cover the deliverability capability of Iran, their missiles. But we'll have to get to that too. But you've got to get to some platform where you can get to the next platform, if it's acceptable. And you're not going to get everything in this first bite, I don't think. It won't work that way. So will they get a deal? I don't know. My guess is that it'll go past June 30th, and as far as I'm concerned, given that time, the Israelis have even come out now and said, go past June 30th. They've softened their position on this, if you need to. And I think I think it's probably a little better than 50-50. We get some kind of an agreement that's agreeable and it's workable, but everything's pretty unpredictable. Somebody else had it? This lady.
You're going to keep going?
No, but this lady had her hand up a long time, so I'll go. I'll give you a short answer. Give me a short question.
Just one last question, please. In deference to the gentleman on my right that asked his question here, Senator, what you just said about the issues with losing our young captains and the people that are going to go into other areas of the world. I'm old enough to know that when I worked with General Westmoreland and his adjunct, and they were leaving Vietnam at that time, and they were leaving for the same reasons. And it's now 20 years later, and they're the same issues. How do we deal with the issues to keep our young men in the armed forces and working with you, and not and spending billions of dollars, but not have enough money to have our own forces working for you?
Well, I think, as you noted, it was actually it was 40 years ago. Big difference because we had a draft army. The army was in probably as bad a shape as it has been in since World War II during that time. The racism, the fragging of officers, the breakdown in discipline. I was there 68, our worst year. We lost over 15,000 dead Americans in 1 year. Can you imagine that? Would the American public put up with that today? Over 15,000 kids, we sent their bodies back in 1 year. It's a different dimension, different people, different set of situations. But your fundamental question is relevant. The way you keep these great young people is, first of all, you give them a career. Not you give them, but you offer. You offer them a career that they can be proud of, they can contribute in, they can enhance their professional and personal lives. That's how you start it. Then, in order to do that, to recruit these kind of people and fulfill those promises, retain those people, then in fact the benefits have to be there. They have to be adequately paid. They'll never make as much money in the military as they're going to make on the outside. I mean, but that's their choice, because the military gives them a life that in each person's different, but in most of these young people, I ask them all the time. I used to have lunches in my office, Secretary of Defense's office. Nobody else in the room. I'd have about 10 junior enlisted come in, all alone, sit down with the Secretary of Defense. 10 junior officers come in all alone with the Secretary of Defense. And I say, tell me what you think. When we go around the table, be honest with me. I said, nobody's taking notes. You're not going to get in trouble. What do you think? And I'd ask them questions. Why do you stay at this? How did you get into this? And the same answers I get from every one of them. It's exactly what I just said. So you've got to be able to fulfill the commitments you make to them. Education is a huge, huge thing to these young people. I was saying here tonight, our military is the best educated force in America. All our senior officers, PhDs, a couple of advanced degrees, master's degrees, I mean, that's just kind of average. Half of our enlisted have college degrees. There wasn't a young person, I don't believe, in my 2 years in meeting with all these hundreds and hundreds of kids, and when I'd go out to bases everywhere, I'd always have private lunches with just the junior people, nobody else in the room. And I don't think there was a time whenever any one of them didn't tell me when I would ask the question, are you working on your education? If they didn't have a degree, they knew where they wanted to go and the kind of degree they wanted. Many of them were working on master's degrees. It's a huge part of this. My guess is that most American people would not know that, But this is just another dimension of answering your question. How do you keep these young people in? But you've got to give everybody in life, and this is fundamental to anything, you all know this. People have to feel they're respected, they're valued, and the time and commitment they put into an institution is important to somebody else, to the country, and that they're bringing value added. If you can't give that to somebody, then you're not going to have a successful company or army or anything else. It's as fundamental as the sun coming up in the morning. One more, quick, and we'll get out of here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for taking a question from a reporter even after
Yeah,
at the end of
your
this
reporter is no fair. It's, you can.
Yeah, that's why Pentagon Press Corps loves you. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. According to, after you left the office, we know that there are some differences between the administration and your perspective, especially in terms of the struggle against ISIL. Can you please share your assessment with us in terms of the results of the Inherent Resolve operation so far? How do you see the operation? How is it going? Is it in the right direction or not? And secondly, I asked this question as exactly 2 years ago when you conducted your first press briefing in Pentagon. Since you are a genuine Turkey friend and also expert on Turkey, how do you see the direction of Turkey, especially given the fact that there are some major differences between U.S. and Turkey in terms of this fight against ISIL and some rule of law or other human rights problems in Turkey?
The journalist trying to sneak in a two-part question here.
Yeah, this is what I had to deal with all the time. I mean,
should the administration have done differently some things vis-a-vis the relations with Turkey?
Okay. Well, I'm going to give you some short answers. Turkey. Turkey has been an indispensable member of NATO since 1952. And Turkey's involvement with the West, particularly NATO, has been critical. Where Turkey resides, the geography, the history, and the religious dimensions of Turkey are also particularly important. Always has been, but especially today. Turkey's going through a transition. Joe Biden and I were the first two politicians to meet this new leader of Turkey that really no one knew. By his name, you all recognize it today, Erdogan. When his new party, the Justice Development Party, swept 90% of the parliament, the current parliament in Turkey in December 2002, swept them out of power. And Biden and I were in the Middle East for a 10-day trip, Israel, Syria, so on and so on. And we were in Turkey and spent 3 hours with Assad. before we went to, in Syria, before we went to Turkey, and another 3 hours with Erdogan. The United States has differences with Turkey on certain areas, but it's important that that relationship between the United States and Turkey continue to strengthen. The base, the NATO base in Turkey today, Incirlik, is a critical base for NATO. And so we've had some differences. We continue to have some differences. But Turkey has been a friend. It's been an ally. We need to make sure in every way we can that continues to be that way. Leaders come and go. Leaders come and go. We have differences with Erdogan in certain areas. So that's first on Turkey. ISIS. You may have been at the press conference I held more than a year ago when I was asked the question about ISIS. This phenomenon that was now surging through Iraq. And if you were there, you recall what I said. It got a lot of play. And there were certain people in the administration that were not happy with what I said. But I said, ISIS represents a group, an entity, it's too early to define what they are, that we've never seen before. They are militarily adept. They have astounding financing sources. They use social media better than most countries do. They have played upon the Sunni disaffection in the west of Iraq because of how Maliki mishandled his 5 years and made things worse, not integrating the Sunnis into the government. So it just made it raw and deeper, the Sunni-Shia divide, plus the Kurds up in the north. ISIS has used all of this in a very smart way. And I said this more than a year ago. Since then, ISIS has grown and become deliberately more powerful. That's been a result of an Assad government that's essentially a provincial government. Assad governs very little of Syria. In fact, most of Syria today is ungoverned, as a good part of Iraq is. All of Libya is. Yemen is ungoverned. And so ISIS has forged these elements together in a very successful way. And we're going to be dealing with ISIS for a while. And what we're trying to do is assist the Iraqis, the central government, but it's complicated because the Kurds essentially have an autonomous region, as you know so well. They've got their own army, they've had their own army, essentially their own economy, their own oil resources. They want to break away from Iraq. The Sunnis in the West represents another issue. Until some of that begins to get resolved, ISIS is still going to be a player, is going to be a significant problem. Now, Iran is in Iraq in a more defined, deliberate way than ever before. Probably Iran has more influence in Iraq today than anybody does. The Iranian militia, Hezbollah, the Shia militia, those are just facts of life. So ISIS still represents a huge threat as it continues to develop terrorists through their social media, through their recruitment inside those areas, those countries, and then pushing them back out to Europe and other places. So we're going to be dealing with that for a long time. But as I said in some of my earlier remarks about how you get at this, we can't do this ourselves. It isn't going to be 100,000 more American troops in Iraq to stabilize Iraq. Those days are over. And it never really did what we wanted it to do other than when our troops were there. train, equip, support, but until the local leaders, the local people, are able to come together with some recognition and understanding of what they're going to have to do to work their way out of this, it ain't going to happen. ISIS is not, the good news about ISIS, it's not in the interests of any nation state. The Iranians are against ISIS. The Syrians, at least Assad, most Syrians, most Iraqis, the Kurds, the Turks, the Gulf states, they're all against ISIS. So are we. So is the West. So you build on the common denominators of agreement. That's how you start any fundamental coalition. You build on a fundamental platform of agreement, and you work out from there. We're going to have problems with Iran and everybody else for a long time. You're not going to solve that. But this one is real, and you're going to have to deal with it, and it's going to be a while. The next president of the United States will, a big part of the next president's agenda will be this, as I believe it will be Russia. And China will be an ongoing challenge. But I'll end this way with what I said earlier. It's how you manage these. And you don't let the little things get out of control. And you keep them in the smaller channels as you manage through them. Thank you all very much. Good night. Thank you. Pat, thank you.